We need the likes and we need the subscribes. I have a guest on that's a returning guest, Brian Krause, who wrote the book The Law and Men. And good to have you, Brian. And we'll talk about Chapter 5, Men and Vice.
Yes, thank you for having me, Stephen.
Okay. Yeah, so can you go into a little bit about Chapter 5 here?
Sure. Well, chapter 5 meshes with some of the themes in the rest of the book. I go again, one of the recurring themes is that a lot of our law revolves around the male duty to provide resources for women and children. And I tried to show how that theme, how it affected other areas of the law. It also affected how we regulate vice. And in this chapter, I try to make the case that a lot of our laws, a lot of the way that we regulate vice, it has to do with steering male resources into uses that are deemed worthy by society. And it's also designed to keep men from doing things that society deems destructive and undermines that goal of having men provide resources for women and children.
Okay. And in this in this book, or when you write about Vice and Men, what was the main reason for why they made, let's say, gambling illegal? What was
Well,
their their agenda with that?
very good question. And what I try to do is I try to make the point that if you look at the vices that the law has forbidden over the centuries, and I'm talking even about things that aren't necessarily regarded as a vice anymore. For instance, various homosexual behavior, gambling, drinking, all these things, all these activities were activities that in some way, shape, or form undermined the ability of men to provide for women. So, in one part of the book, I make the point that, okay, gambling potentially depletes familial resources. Drinking and substance abuse keep men from providing for their families. Back in the day when homosexual activities were illegal, obviously the men who engaged in those activities were not forming relationships with women, having children, providing for those children. General promiscuity, prostitution, etc., again, led to issues, marital discord, depletion of familial resources on promiscuous women, etc., etc. So a lot of the laws related to that, again, are about steering male energy and resources into providing for women and children. And obviously, though when you look at those vices that I just mentioned, obviously a lot of them had other reasons as well. I'm not suggesting that was the only reason, but a big theme in vice regulation has been controlling men. And what you can see throughout history, and you can see this now as well, people get nervous when they think men are engaging in destructive behavior, right? So it kind of conflicts with this idea that we have today. You have a lot of activists who will push this idea that our culture is beholden to a boys will be boys mentality. In other words, we let men do what they want and get away with acting inappropriate and whatnot. It's actually just the opposite. If you study the history on this, you study our law as it is now, you'll also see throughout history a lot of women were involved in these movements. Prohibition, a lot of anti-vice muckraking endeavors were led by women even before they could vote. They had an enormous impact on these matters. I mentioned the New York Female Moral Reform Society. They used to engage in activism designed to stop activities that they thought were exploitative of women, typically focused on prostitution, but other acts of promiscuity as well. So I think I make a good case that we certainly don't live in a culture that's beholden to this boys will be boys mentality. Just as I think in chapter 3, I made the case that we don't let men get away with sexual misconduct and other inappropriate behavior.
Yeah. Uh, do you think with like non-violent crime, like uh, doing drugs, for example, or well, I don't think gambling is illegal anymore. But like, or let's say prostitution. Why, why, why do you think in in most states prostitution is still illegal? Because
Well,
from what I get out of it is, okay, if you're gonna, you know, if a man pays for a prostitute, sleeps with her, I don't know who he's affecting other than himself if he gets an STD from the hooker. But what why why do you think it's still illegal in most states?
I always get people upset when I say this. I know there's not just one reason, but I think the overriding reason why prostitution is still illegal is that, and I make this case at the end of the chapter. With prostitution, you have a situation where here we are, we're 50 to 70 years after the sexual revolution, right? All kinds of promiscuity is not only allowed, it's in some cases it's encouraged, it's promoted in our schools, etc., etc. Why all these years after the sexual revolution is prostitution still legal? And by the way, I'm not taking a position one way or another. At least in the book, I don't take a position one way or another on whether or not it should be legal. But I ask the question, why is this one thing illegal when pretty much everything else is legal? I mean, I make the point, like with pornography, you can record people engaging in these activities, you can sell it to the public, perfectly legal. Well, why is prostitution illegal then? Well, the reason is we can't. I think we can't have another outlet where men can engage in sexual relations outside of marriage, and thus avoid all the consequences and all the liabilities, and find another way to avoid long-term financial commitments to women. So what you have then is you have this problem because even with a lot of feminists, they've pushed sexual liberation for a very long time. And it seems contradictory. Well, my body, my choice. How can we tell someone then that they can't exchange sex for money? Well, the way you do it is you reframe it as exploitation. And you'll see this on the left and on the right politically. Both sides view prostitution as a form of exploitation, even putting it on par with human trafficking, which is not to say, let me just say also, it's not to say that it doesn't manifest itself in that way sometimes. There certainly is exploitation and whatnot. But the reason why prostitution remains illegal across the board, in my opinion, even in a culture that's a lot more liberal now about these things since the sexual revolution, is they can't allow another way for men to avoid long-term financial commitments to women. I think if they did that, I think people think civilization would fall apart. So I think that's the motivating factor behind it. They can't just let men just pay outside of marriage and avoid all those commitments.
Yeah, yeah, it's a good point. And something I've never understood in society is, for example, why we jail those who have been found with drugs. Why, or we should decriminalize it, maybe. Make them either do community service or go to rehab if they have a problem. But I don't see the good in what happens when you send drug users to jail and there might not be adequate treatment in jail. I mean, I don't know about many of these jails, but even like a drug dealer, let's say, unless if the drug dealer is forcing it in you or on you and making you use it, um, uh, should these laws become more lax and deregulated?
Well, so that's a great question, and that's a great issue to debate. And as you know, I'm not shy about debating these things. I'm always happy to get into a debate about the issues itself. But as you know in the book, just as with prostitution, I don't get into one way or another my opinions on drug legalization or decriminalization, any of that. The point I try to make again is that these regulations are inspired by the desire to make sure that men are working, that they're producing for their families. And of course, drugs and alcohol do undermine that ability. I mean, that was one of the arguments in Prohibition, was you had men not only getting violent with their wives and whatnot, but undermining their ability to provide for their families. And of course, to be fair, again, this, a lot of this book is about, you know, challenging these ideas that men have special privileges and whatnot. But I will be the first to admit that statistically, these destructive behaviors, more often than not, they're men who engage in them. Men drink more than women. Men use illicit drugs more than women. Men gamble more than women. And that, of course, is reflected in the arrests. Men are arrested more for these vices as well. But again, I think a lot of these regulations are designed to steer male energy and resources into uses deemed worthy by society.
Yeah, and another way to think of it is, I guess the uh, more how should I say it? The more regulated you have society, the more control I guess the system has over you in a way. It has over everybody. And in a way, I sometimes uh, wonder if that's how the system wants it, because it's a good way to make money off of people. Now you have to go find a lawyer, and then you're in jail, and then and or in prison, and prison is kind of like um, a business now. If it's a private business, if it's a private prison now, so would that be kind of correct in a way?
Well, I mean, that goes again to the issue of what are the motives behind these vice regulations. I mean, I'm sure there's not just one. And I'm sure, you're talking there about private prisons or for-profit prisons.
Hmm.
Sure, I mean, you could probably make a connection there and say that that's one reason for these regulations. That's typically not what I focused on in this chapter, though.
Yeah.
I tried to make the argument again that it's about controlling men, steering their resources, their energy in the right direction. I'd also say this. Look, I don't. Again, I'm not shy about sharing my opinions, but as far as this idea that the point I was making in the book was that I'm not trying to say that these state interests are illegitimate. In many cases, they are. The fear that men aren't going to provide for women. You go back to Prohibition, for instance. It was inspired by legitimate fears. I mean, that Ken Burns documentary about Prohibition I thought was great. And at that time, people don't realize this, I think, but at that time, Americans drank a lot more back then. Some of that had to do with the water not being as good. So you had people who, I mean, their whole lives would be ruined by alcohol. You had families who couldn't, they couldn't get ahead. The children weren't getting food and whatnot because the men were out drinking and engaging in violence and everything else. So legitimate fears inspired a lot of these movements. Of course, I do think they go overboard sometimes. I did make the point. I didn't share a lot of my opinions. I did share my opinion on that prohibition had gone too far. That was an example of this desire to regulate encroaching on our civil liberties, and I think that happens sometimes these days as well. But the fear that inspires a lot of these regulations, I wouldn't say in and of itself is wrong. I mean, there are legitimate fears behind these regulations.
Okay, yeah, yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. Um, Before the episode is almost done. Before we head off, is there anything else in this chapter that you want to point out?
No, in closing, I would just say this, and you find this in a lot of the chapters. I'm trying to challenge this idea that people have this mentality that men have all these privileges and advantages, and They can do whatever they get away with just bad behavior. This in this chapter, I tried to challenge this idea of that our culture and our law is beholden to a boys will be boys mentality. It's not. We punish men who act out. We regulate men. We've always regulated men, and the purpose behind that, of course, was often for the benefit of women and children. So I challenge the idea that men have all these advantages and can just do whatever they want. I think that's incorrect.
Okay, good, good. Thank you for coming on. The Law and Men is the book by Brian Krause. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.